This is Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. Future Sense Now is brought to you by the Futures Forum. Stay tuned for a journey to the future with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of Future Sense Now, the online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. It is April 2018 and we're celebrating this Earth Day with an exploration into the future of islands. We're looking at smart islands 2030 and beyond. The United Nations states that small islands have very different challenges, and we hear a lot about climate change and existential threats to islands due to rising sea levels. Indeed, since 1994, the UN has recognized the specific challenges facing small island developing states, in particular, the particular risk of marginalization emanating from their small size, remoteness from large markets, high economic vulnerability to economic and natural shocks beyond their domestic control. And so in this segment, I'll be speaking to Dr. GILLIAN Marcelle about her experience working as a technologist and a development expert in addressing challenges facing small islands and how emerging technologies will help us become smarter. Dr. Marcelle is a senior leader in economic international business and has a proven track record in attracting investment in emerging markets. She's currently working as executive director for the U.S. Virgin Islands Technology Park and has successfully transformed the economic agency, doubling the number of technology and knowledge-based firms in the last 3 years. And she is an affiliated researcher at the Tata Center for Technology and Design at MIT Cambridge, as well as she holds appointments at the UVI School of Business. Without further ado, I should also add, I must not forget, she's also the founder of Technology for Development. So without further ado, let me welcome our special guest, Dr. GILLIAN Marcelle. How are you? I'm so happy you could join us.
I'm so happy and delighted that to be having this conversation with you, Claire.
I really want to start by this notion of what is a smart island, because when I started hearing this is being applied to islands, one of my first questions was, is it exactly like smart cities, which is just talking about ICT and operational efficiency of government services, or is the smart islands different in some way? What is your take on how you would define a smart island?
Thanks so much for that question. For me, as a Caribbean person, as someone who has lived for many years on the continent of Africa, I think that SMART needs to focus on the areas and the things, the efforts that we take to actually improve the capacities of human beings. So that for me, technology is always in service of human beings. And increasingly, because of the dangers of climate change and so on, we probably need to extend that into technologies being used in service of stewardship of the planet. Mm-hmm. So for me, SMART is about improving our ability to live well, to live healthier lives, to live more joyous lives, and to live lives that actually provide both wealth and well-being for future generations. So that's my definition of what is smart. And within that, of course, we can use technologies of various sorts and various types, but it must be in service of some higher goal.
Right, so as you talk about the Agenda 2030, I mean, the islands are signatories to so many different arrangements, but as we talk about Agenda 2030 in particular, which is probably the most well-known, I guess, idea that we're trying to popularize, we're talking about combating inequalities, building just and inclusive societies, protecting human rights, and ensuring protection of the planet and its natural resources. And when we look at those agendas, and we look at the challenges around, as you spoke about climate change, well, that also affects the health of our oceans, water, energy, waste management. How are you seeing technology, as somebody who's been looking at this for some time, helping to address these challenges in a way that does contribute to improved quality of life?
And so thanks again for directing the attention to the role that technologies can play. At the heart of this question, and perhaps the answer rather than the question, is the notion that technologies are always socially constructed. They should be shaped by a set of higher objectives, and therefore they are tools. And so societies that have done well to harness technologies have approached them in that way. Whether it is the transformation of Japan several decades ago, whether it is Singapore moving from a developing country status to one of the most sophisticated economies in the world in a relatively short period of time, whether it is individual examples of how societies have used technologies for their own interests. One of the examples that I love to speak about is the transformation of Estonia through a combination of political will. Estonia did not necessarily invent the technologies that it used for its own transformation, but what it did was that it marshaled resources, it marshaled political will, it marshaled human imagination and enthusiasm to harness the internet, and resulted in Estonia now being one of the sort of most successful digital economies. And I particularly like the example of Estonia because, of course, it is a rather small country. And so coming from the Caribbean, where we often believe, or recently, that our small size or the individual size of the individual nations can sort of be an excuse in some senses for our underperformance on many development indicators. And so I often speak with decision makers about the example of Estonia. There are other examples in the middle of Europe. If you don't want to use the more well-known examples of how technologies can be marshaled.
Yeah, but how is that working on the ground for you? I mean, you've been living and working on this issue in the Virgin Islands directly, you said you have transformed, brought new technologies to bear. What technologies have you put in place before the hurricane, that might have, if they would have not been destroyed, but might have had a difference in terms of the efficiencies of the islands, let's say, operations of its natural resources and its human resources and its human capital and its social capital?
So the U.S. Virgin Islands is, as you know, three islands that are non-independent territories of the United States, sitting in the northern part of the Caribbean. The total population of the three islands is 100,000 people. So this is a real a microstate, and it's not a state, it's a territory. Mm-hmm. And for the last 3 years, I have been heading up an economic development agency that brings technology and knowledge-intensive firms to the U.S. Virgin Islands. Those firms are primarily involved in information technology, and what the result of the firms coming into the U.S. Virgin Islands has meant is that they have created both indirect employment as well as direct employment. And what they have also been able to do is they've been able to provide a positive economic multiplier in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Those are some of the more traditional ways in which the companies have actually benefited the territory recently, and particularly after the hurricane, where the benefit of bringing in human capital and also ways of working that were different from what might otherwise have been on the ground really showed up is in the difference in terms of the way in which the RTPark companies and other large private sector companies in the US Virgin Islands approach the issue of business continuity. So that while you have a lot of devastation, physical assets that were destroyed, the building that housed the RTPark program has pretty much been destroyed, but the program has not been destroyed. Because in the 21st century, of course, business is organized to be independent of bricks and mortar. And so we were able to continue an economic development program, although our physical building was destroyed. And that is true.
So is that because most of your things were on the cloud? Is that because most of your knowledge assets were on the cloud? So you're saying that the use of cloud assets is certainly one way in which islands can become more resilient. Is that what you're saying?
So the cloud is one sort of terminology for this, but it's about distributing your information technology assets. It's about actually having preparedness in terms of continuity practices as part of the way that you do business. And so it was interesting to see the kinds of companies that were able to get up and running. I'll tell you a funny story. Women who cook food in small informal businesses were some of the people who were fastest able to be up and ready after the hurricane. Why? Because they're off the grid. They're using propane gas to cook the food that they are delivering for their customers. It's a simple example, but when we think of off the grid, we think of it in terms of a very sophisticated set of arrangements. You can have off the grid solutions that are purely informal as well. And so in the US Virgin Islands, there were...
Well, but I'm going to stop you right there, because you're talking about propane gas, but from the point of view of the future, that's not a smart solution for the Caribbean region, because that's imported. And even, I guess it's cheap. It's cheaper. Maybe it's subsidized by the island because it's a territory of the United States. But if it's not subsidized, then the people are still going to face the same challenges of the expense of trying to run an economy that is not able to support itself because your scale factors are not there. So if you are suggesting that building back better, might be okay, let's go off the grid, no electric stove, let's go back to gas. That to me would not be like a smart future solution, because it's not improving the economic efficiency of the island.
So no, I think, Claire, you misinterpreted what I want you to get out of that example. What I want you to get out of that example is right now in the Caribbean and elsewhere, we have, and the US Virgin Islands is a particularly good example of that. We have concentrated grids, which are often monopolies. And we have not gone particularly for decentralized network solutions with anything, whether it's power, whether it's communications. And so I was using the example of one off-grid example in the case of informal restaurants. The solution, in my view, for smart, intelligent approaches to the things that are really important, which would include power and communication, is to think about network design where you are moving away from monopolies, where you are also, as you rightly say, you are thinking about capitalizing the resources that we have, high levels of irradiation in the Caribbean. You know, there's sunshine. This is one of our natural assets. Do we make use of it? You know the answer to it. That's a rhetorical question. And so the future of the Caribbean certainly should include smart, decentralized energy, smart, decentralized solutions in terms of communications that is resilient, but also affordable and making much better use of renewable energy.
Have any of the companies that you brought solutions to water management or energy management or waste management or which to me are some of the critical questions, or ocean assets management? Were any of those companies in that space?
So we have one of the companies that we approved post the hurricane is in the area of smart energy and also smart communications. And one of the applications that is still going through the regulatory process is a very exciting generator of ocean thermal energy,
Mm-hmm.
which is particularly well suited to the Caribbean,
Mm-hmm.
because it's a very exciting technology that uses the difference in the depth of the ocean to
Wow.
actually generate energy, and also as a byproduct to generate to generate drinkable water, potable water. So this is both an energy and a water generation. The fixed capital required for those types of applications are in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
I know.
And
So how is that? I mean, is it in that? Is this a new one that's much more affordable?
No, it is not. This is the company is actually listed on the stock exchange in the United States as part of its capital raising efforts. Thankfully, the feasibility studies and so on for the US Virgin Islands were very well received. And they also have some of their products already in prototype and in operation in a resort in the Bahamas, as well as naval applications on the island of Hawaii.
Well, it is very interesting because ever since 1970s, I've been hearing about ocean thermal. People have been trying to do ocean wave energy. People have been trying to do tidal wave energy and all sorts of things, and we still have not been able to find an affordable solution to the use of the ocean space. And even when you do, then people are concerned about, well, we need the beach for tourism, is going to clash. But as one of the things I remember reading recently is that that the hurricane was an opportunity for Google to test its Project Loon to provide telecommunications reboots for some people in Puerto Rico. Has any of that, did you experience any of that in the Virgin Islands, and what would that experience have taught you as to what could actually be sustained?
So in this 8-month period, I have not been involved in any of the rollout of new types of communications technologies, but in the past, on the continent of Africa, where the issues are very similar, where you have vast amounts of land and very distributed populations, there are really exciting technologies, including the use of the white space technology that we usually associate with a channel that seems to be out of focus. And there's some really interesting new technologies that are coming up in terms of using that band of the spectrum, the frequency spectrum, to actually deliver broadband internet.
And so that is exciting. I hope that is something. The challenge I find that many times happens is that they let's say the return on investment of the research dollar for these challenges is often not there. because small countries don't have the money to say pay for it, even if they have the numbers in aggregate, right? They don't. The people who will be buying the service, quote unquote, can't afford to pay. Have you given any thought to in your work over the years at how you then look at new models of measuring benefits that might make these small, quote unquote, so-called in economic groupings be more attractive to investors who typically want to have a lot of money from one shot?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think you've really hit the nail on the head, because particularly for the Caribbean, the idea of assessing the benefit at regional scale, I think it is time for us to return to some of those questions about what is the scale of the Caribbean and the regional project that, as you know, as you're also from the Caribbean, it was an effort that was to some extent abandoned in, maybe 50 years ago. And it is important that we return to that. So that's the one half of the answer. The second half of the answer is that, thankfully, the world of private capital is also changing. And so last year around this time, I gave a talk in Barbados about the importance of the Caribbean actually engaging with impact investment, blended finance. And I was interested to see that that is one of the key points coming out of this year's spring meeting. So I am hoping that both from the policymaker side in the Caribbean and from our development partners, that we're going to find a way for this to actually take root in the Caribbean.
Yeah, I do think this whole notion of impact investment has been totally underserved. I have sort of been talking about it, I think, since 2012 at the Jamaica Stock Exchange conferences. Haven't gotten very far. We talked about the social stock exchange. But you are, I think, as somebody who is an economist, I'm wondering if in some of your research, you're looking at some of the new metrics that we might begin to pull together as small island states. I mean, there are 55 small island states per se, and then a couple, maybe like 50 or so, which are not states, but they belong to, like Greece or, Northern Europe or whatever. So altogether, we probably have about 100 small islands that have people living on them. Have you given any thought to, as an economist, to maybe coming up with working on a new metric that is more suitable for defining well-being and productivity and all of those things that at the scale up which means sense for island economies? Because I think it's really unfair that we're judging, an elephant with the same scale as you're judging a mongoose. I mean,
yes. So I think that the Caribbean politicians and officials and so on have been, I think, raising this question about, are we being graduated unfairly? So I think there are folks who are working on this sort of the political dimension of that. I think at the heart of what your question is, though, it's really an important one, because it is, and having lived for a long time in Johannesburg, the 3 years in the US Virgin Islands has got me to understand small size in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I am still trying to make sense of whether or not the benefits that we derive as human beings from living in very small communities, that sense of connectedness and so on, whether that is outweighed by the increasing vulnerability, the increasing sense of sort of lack of power in the global sphere and so on. And I had a wonderful opportunity to sort of discuss this last week with Jamaica Kincaid. And she was here in the US Virgin Islands for the VI Lit Fest. And, we were bouncing around ideas, and they came up with this notion of the paradox of paradise. And so I think small countries are really going to have to find ways to maximize the things that are really our strength, that sense of connectedness, the resilience at a human level that has been on display for everyone to see. You know, after 2 Category 5 hurricanes, it's 8 months after, but the community has really responded in ways to take care of each other and so on. But on an economic level, the economic metrics for the entire Caribbean is not where we want them to be. So we haven't yet found ways to make that small size benefit us in a global community where it is arguably getting more difficult for microstates and small states and so on. And so I think we need to be looking very seriously back at the regional project. We need to be thinking about the issue of how are we using our, the extent of our population, because many Caribbean people, we talk about small size, but if we were counting the Caribbean diaspora for people who are in metropoles all over the world, we would probably be at a much more viable size. So and you have worked for years on that very question. And I think thirdly, it is where we sort of started, which is, what are these technologies that we're talking about? And I like to think about technologies as really ways of doing. Some of them are scientific and require scientific and technological knowledge, but there are also other kinds of ways of doing that we need to be drawing on, from which we can derive economic benefit.
So as we come down to this idea of other ways of doing, I'd like for you to see if maybe you can come up with an acronym then that would better define SMART. Because if smart cities is going to be the lens, one of the lenses through which we explore our journey to 2030, and I'm passionate about 2030 agenda and unabashedly and unashamedly an evangelist for that as a way to go forward for the Caribbean region, for small islands in general, for all people around the world, quite frankly. I would like us to really make sure that as people begin to take up this idea of the smart island as the next buzz thing, that we all are saying the same thing. So what does S mean? Is S going to mean systems thinking leadership, or strategic thinking leadership, or sustainable systems leadership? What is M going to mean? Is M going to be meaning measurable?
Meaning. It's going to be meaning,
Or
because
measurable. So in that sense, then meaningful metrics.
Exactly. And
because
so
the GNP for us and growth for us is not a meaningful metric.
Yes. And so I'm so glad that you've circled right back to the fact that we have to interrogate, we have to reimagine SMART so that we actually make it mean something other than high technology that then alienates our people. If SMART means intelligent, then Caribbean people and other people in the global South feel that, yes, anyone can be intelligent. But if we continue to use these words to mean technological in a way that is a synonym for Silicon Valley, all we're doing is alienating the majority of the world's population. So to answer your question, SMART must be something that is meaningful, and it must have people at its center rather than the hardware associated with different technologies.
Can we have A to mean agile adaptability?
Yes.
So you can live with that, because I'm going to come up with my own acronym, because I can't wait anymore for someone to tell me what it means, and I want to make sure that as I use it to drive dialogue, I am able to define it in a way that most people can live with it. So what about R? Resilience?
Resilient.
And what else?
T can either be thoughtful or technology. as long as you
What
make it
about
plural.
transformative
I love it.
technology?
I love it. I love it.
So you can live with transformative technology.
Yes. And so
So,
there we are. We
so
have
there we are. We
S.
have come to the end and we have solved the problems of the generation. I always like to feel like at the end of the conversation, I have arrived somewhere. This is very good to know. So seriously though, as we wrap up, one last question or a couple last questions. They talk about paradigm shifts, recognizing the need to have 10% of people in the community to reach a tipping point. What will it take for us to have 10% of the Caribbean people thinking about becoming smarter island economies in the next 2 to 3 years, so that by 2030 we'll be better approaching a more, let's say, inclusive, prosperous way of life for more people?
So I think that you are one of the persons who is already doing what needs to be happening. It is conversations, it is dialogue, it is what Jamaicans call reasoning. It's what wasn't it Walter Rodney who talked about groundings. It's about all of those things, those practices that we know make a difference, that we've sometimes gone away from, because without it, what we have had is we've had 30 years, in my view, of alienation and 30 years of economic policy that's not been people-centered. And the results are pretty obvious. It's not working.
Well, yes, but I don't want to end at that note. So let's say, looking forward then, based on your experience, based on what you see happening, based on what you will be working on going forward, what is a nice, optimistic headline of 2030 that you believe you will see?
So we have to, as individuals, take responsibility for what we can do. What can we do? We can do what you and others are doing. We can shape and contribute to dialogue. We also need to be electing and holding accountable our leaders, political leaders and other leaders, for being responsible for transformative change that makes a difference for the majority of the Caribbean people.
That's a whole nother conversation.
But it is necessary.
We're going to have to
come back necessary.
That requires a whole other conversation. What I want to close with is a headline from 2030 about smart islands that have emerged since 2018. So now it's 12 years into the future.
Yes.
What are you seeing in our smart island movement? How is it looking if you're standing in 2030 on Earth Day 2030?
On Earth Day 2030, we will be celebrating that the Caribbean is producing between 70% of its energy needs using renewable energy. We will be celebrating that we have reduced the agricultural products import bill significantly. And we are doing that on the basis of organic and human-centered agricultural practices, where we are also doing it in a way where we are not destroying arable land in our islands. We are doing it in a way where we have much more diversified economies. So we are moving away from one crop or one sector economies, whether it's energy in Trinidad or tourism in much of the rest of the Caribbean. So that's my look forward for the Caribbean.
Well, thank you so much. I think it's a very great note on which to bring this conversation to an end, which is optimistic. It paints a picture that I think many people would like to live with, and certainly help us look for 2030 for this idea of sustainable systems, meaningful measures, aspirational agility and adaptability,
Resilient.
resilient and transformational technology that can really make inclusive prosperity a reality. So thank you so much, Dr. Gillian Marcelle, founder of Technology for Development, for joining us in this conversation.
Thank you, Claire, for the invitation, and thank you so much for the work that you have been doing in imagining a future that we all want to be a part of.
Well, we've come to the end of a great conversation, folks. Thank you so much for joining us on Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. This conversation has ended, but the story continues being written by all of us. Creating the future we want is our shared responsibility, because remember, it is better for us to act as the parent of our future than the child of our past. And as we say in Jamaica, walk good, safe journeys.
You have been listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson, brought to you by the Futures Forum. For more, please visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Thank you for listening. Spread the word. Share the future.